Good morning. I'm Gord Long with the Financial Repression Authority. I have Michael Snyder, author, publisher of the Economic Collapse blog and other blogs, joining us this morning. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you for having me on again. It's good to be with you.
It's been a while. I said other blogs because you have another blog too now. Or no, I shouldn't say a blog, another site.
Yeah. The economiccollapseblog.com is the site I'm most known for. And if people just go to Google and type in the economic collapse, it comes right up. But that site is focused kind of tightly on economics, financial issues, that kind of thing. I have another website, endoftheamericandream.com, which kind of explores a wider variety of political and social and things happening around the world. So it's a broader variety of issues, but those are the two main websites that I write for. And then, of course, articles from both of those sites are taken and are shared all over the internet.
Michael, could you give our listeners just a brief outline of your background, things you've been involved with before you got involved in writing on the web?
Sure. I'm actually a graduate of the University of Florida Law School, where I got a JD and an LLM. And then from there, I went back to my old stomping grounds in Washington, D.C. And I worked right in the heart of Washington, D.C. For a number of years as an attorney. Right down on, my wife and I lived across the river in Northern Virginia. And every morning I would get up and go on the metro and head over. And I worked right down on the heart of K Street. And so I worked there for a number of years. And as I was working, I was just becoming increasingly distressed about the direction of our country, the corruption I saw all around me. But I thought, what in the world could I possibly do? You know, no one knew who I was, no one who cared who I was. How could I possibly have any kind of measurable impact? Well, one day I decided to start blogging. And, you know, at the time there were well over 1 million blogs out there. So I thought, well, who in the world is going to care to read what I have to write? But I stuck with it. And at first, very, very few people took notice of what I was doing, but over time, it really grew as I stuck with it. And today, of course, the audience is very, very large, and my articles are seen on dozens of websites all over the world. And so I've been able to write about these things and a lot of things we're going to talk about today, economics and financial issues, and the things I write about really strike a chord because people know they're not getting the truth from the mainstream media, so they're seeking out alternative sources of information, such as my website, such as the videos that you do, because people are looking for answers.
Absolutely, and they're looking for facts. And one of the things that you really noted for is your lists of various subject areas, and you list the facts. You don't just not opinion. Here are the facts, and lay it right out and do a lot of great research that way. And I really recommend people checking your site because there's just phenomenal research there. Michael, we're here to talk about financial repression this morning. How would you define financial repression? What does it mean to you? How do you consider it?
Yeah, well, what it means to me is I like to focus on who's doing the repressing in terms of the who question. And the who, to me, the most important actors in the financial repression that's going on are governments, of course, and central banks, in particular the Federal Reserve. And so we've got these central planners out there who, to me, are anathema to a free market system. To me, markets work best, the finances work best, economies work best when free market forces are allowed to take their course. And of course, that's not ever always smooth, and free markets don't always produce the precise results that we would want in the short term. And so there's always this temptation to monkey with it, to manipulate it, to centrally control in order to manipulate and manufacture results that we desire. But in the process of doing that, we create many, many more problems and distortions and things which ultimately create things like bubbles, create huge problems down the road. And that's what we've seen. That's what we're seeing right now. And so, that is kind of the angle in terms of that I look at it.
And it's created malinvestment, mispricing of risk, lack of price discovery, and the list goes on. And we don't allow ourselves to have a market correction, an economic correction, to cleanse this. And so that's where this monkeying really can cause serious, serious problems. I think we potentially could be there. Where is it most evident to you right now? Where is it the most blatant, and maybe in the area that's moving the quickest?
Well, I think we've created this big problem with the emerging markets. Where all this easy money, what the Federal Reserve does, it just doesn't have consequences inside the United States, but all over the world. And so there was this period of easy money, hot money, money that flowed into the financial markets. We had all this quantitative easing. And one of the areas where we saw a boom was in lending to the emerging markets all over the world, especially places like South America. And so what they did is all this cheap money, low interest rates, the place like Brazil gorged on debt. And so they accumulated all this tremendous amount of debt, much of it denominated in US dollars. But then what happened is we've seen a turning, first of all, with the commodity prices, which have crashed, gone down significantly. So these emerging markets are now getting less money for their exports, which they have very heavily rely on. Then on the flip side, we've seen the dollar rise now that they've curtailed quantitative easing. They're talking about raising rates, but things like this have caused the value of the dollar to rise against other foreign currencies as other currencies print, other central banks print money wildly and do all these things to devalue their currency. So the US dollar is rising. So, all these emerging markets are stuck with all this debt they accumulated during this bubble. And now they're getting less for their exports, but they've got to use a lot more of their own local currencies to pay back the dollars that are denominated to pay back the debts denominated in US dollars, but the dollar is increasing in value. So it's taking a lot more of their local currencies to service and pay back these debts. And so, it's so similar to what we saw in the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s, the Asian debt crisis of the 1990s. It's a very, very similar scenario. And it was caused by the Federal Reserve and other central banks around the world, and this financial manipulation that's taking place. And of course, this is just one example.
Well, the cardinal sin of the carry trade is to borrow in a currency that's rising. So here the emerging markets, as you correctly point out, have borrowed somewhere between $5 and $9 trillion of American money, and now they're on the wrong side of the trade as it strengthens. So it becomes a short squeeze in many ways. So it feeds on itself and forces and makes everything even that much worse. How does it end? Where's the out on this in terms of the emerging markets?
Well, Brazil is already in recession. Argentina is they've got a debt crisis that they're a basket case. You've got other. Venezuela is a nightmare. I don't know that there's an easy out. Now central banks around the world may try to manufacture another intervention and try to find some way to stabilize things. But I think that what we're seeing already is just going to accelerate that, we're going to have emerging markets all over the world really struggle. And this is carrying over into global trade. The biggest bank in the Western world, HSBC in the UK, recently came out and said global trade is down 8.4% globally for the year so far. U.S. exports, Barack Obama said, we're going to increase U.S. exports. Well, U.S. exports are down 11.4% for the year so far. And look over at China. China accounts for more global trade than anyone else. In September, their exports were down 3.7%, but their imports were down 20.4% in September for the month year over year. So we're seeing global trade slow down. We're seeing companies like Caterpillar hit really, really hard as their sales to emerging markets around the world have just, been crippled. So this is a global issue, a global problem. It was created by a global bubble that was created by the Federal Reserve and others. And so I don't know that there's any easy solution. In fact, I believe what we're seeing now is just the initial stages of a crisis that's going to get much, much worse.
So you would agree then we certainly have a global slowdown of pretty serious proportions. And with a strengthening US dollar that you mentioned, it's got to show up eventually in earnings on the stock market because they're repatriating now to a higher dollar level. And what's been keeping it going in terms of stock price has been the buybacks. And now we're seeing cash flows because of slowing revenues, and we've had 2 quarters of negative revenue growth, which is a revenue recession. It's got to show up at some point. Am I overstating that?
Oh, not at all. I think, and this is what we saw in so many things back in 2008 when corporate revenues start to slow down and decline. That's an indication of recession. We've got inventories, wholesale inventories are rising to levels and the inventory to sales ratio rising. There's all this unsold inventory sitting around that's not selling, it's not flowing through the system. The Chinese containerized freight index just hit a record low, lowest ever measured in terms of the amount of stuff being shipped around it. The Cass freight index of inside here of the United States, the amount of stuff being shipped by freight, rail, and air has been declining year over year every month since, I believe, March. So the amount of stuff flowing through the real economy is declining. It's going down. And so we're seeing all these things which indicate that we have entered a recession. In fact, HSBC says that on a dollarized basis, converting all global economic activity into US dollars, global GDP is down 3.4% so far this year. So there's so much evidence that we are already in a recession. Now, the financial markets, the Dow hasn't gotten the memo yet, but just they're a little slow, just like in 2008. But they'll get the memo too. They'll get it, and it's going to be a very, very hard adjustment. And ultimately, I believe that's going to lead to a major crisis, like we saw in 2008. And beyond that, will lead to some of the interventions which I think you want to talk about with the Federal Reserve and others will once again step in. The central planners try to fix things, and I don't think it's going to be pretty.
Yeah, they're going to have to do something when this begins to really unfold. And as you mentioned, the equity markets have been holding up, but the equity markets are always the last. They're like the tail on the dog, and where it starts, where you usually see it, it starts in the credit markets. You start to see turmoil in the credit markets, turmoil in the bond markets on the spreads. And we have that exactly, specifically in the high yield bond market. So if you look at any of those measurements, you can really see a significant tsunami beginning to unfold. So as you mentioned also, the central banks are going to be expected to do something about it when this happens. And it's only a matter of time, you would assume. Now, I have up here a chart with a possible roadmap of alternatives that the Federal Reserve or the central banks may involve or could bring out. It could be a quantitative easing 4 or whatever they label it. We could see negative interest rates versus just zero interest rate policy. We could see something called helicopter money, which is all these are being talked about more and more. What's your sense of what we can expect to unfold going forward here?
Well, personally, I expect initially we're going to see something similar to what we saw in 2008 when we're going to see major financial institutions get into trouble. In fact, around the world, this is already happening, but we're going to see some of these major financial institutions fail. So we're going to have, I believe, multiple Lehman Brothers moments, and this is going to cause panic and fear. And so banks are going to want to lend to one another. They're not going to want to lend to us. We're going to see a credit crunch or a credit freeze, and that's going to really bring economic activity to a standstill and cause what I believe will be relatively short but severe, significant period of deflation, as deflationary pressures as the flow of debt and credit through our system and the global system really kind of grinds to a halt. And now, of course, there will be a response to that, and the exact timing of that we'll have to see, but the Federal Reserve and other central banks will come in and say, okay, we've got to fix this. And so there'll be bailouts, but I think more importantly, there will be, ultimately at some point, more quantitative easing. I believe it'll be on a scale we've never seen before, and I believe that will ultimately lead to the type of inflation that many have warned about in the past, which we, haven't really seen kick in yet, but I believe it's going to come after this short, severe period of deflation. Then eventually we will see the tremendous inflation down the road, and which will, and we'll see intervention after intervention. But I believe that this time the central banks are going to totally lose control.
Yeah, we at the Financial Repression Authority see exactly that roadmap you just laid out. We see further serious deflationary pressures, and then the central banks responding even more aggressively with new policies like the ones I was suggesting or that we had up here earlier, or things we are not expecting. And then we really could see what is referred to as hyperinflation or escalating inflation of significant proportions. And there's, we got $3 trillion sitting over it in excess reserves at the Federal Reserve right now. It could be explosive at some point with the change, but that's speculation. But clearly, there's a cleansing that has got to happen here, because it can't keep going on. Where do you see this leading to? What is the end game here going to be?
Well, I believe that people kind of assume that the problems that caused the crisis back in 2008 and 2009 have been fixed, that something was done, but really nothing was done. Instead, our problems are so much larger. $50 trillion of non-financial debt have been added to the global system since the last time around, and then you've got financial debt on top of that. We've got the derivatives bubble, which is a ridiculous. We've got the shadow banking system, which is blown up to. We've got all these giant bubbles. We've got the bond bubble. You could, of course, that stocks are in a massive bubble too. Stocks, just to get down to. And so they're not in a bubble anymore. Robert Shiller of Yale University, he's developed something called the cyclically adjusted price to earnings ratio. And at the peak of the market, it was at about 27. In order to get back down to the long-term historical average, it's about 15 or 16. So the market would have to fall about 40% from the peak of the market just to get back to average, to normal, where there's not a bubble, much less falling beneath that. And same thing with the Buffett indicator, the ratio of corporate equities to GDP. In other words, the size of the stock market in relation to the size of the economy. That's got to fall about 40% just to get back to the historical long-term average. So we've got all these giant bubbles which have been blown up by financial manipulation by central banks and others. So I believe we are going to see financial crisis, financial crash, more intervention, which is going to cause other problems. Ultimately, I believe we're going to see major financial institutions all over the world fail. I believe we're going to see a loss of faith completely and entirely this time around in the central banks of the world and governments. And I believe this is going to cause economic chaos around the globe on a scale we've never seen before in our times. And I believe this is a kind of a tragedy which is going to play out over years, and it's going to fundamentally, I believe, transform our standard of living and the world around us as we move forward.
What does somebody do to prepare themselves for this eventuality?
Well, in the short term, there's different strategies that are going to be required: short term, mid-term, long term. In the short term, something really basic is, well, you've got to, in terms of your exposure to financial assets that could crash in value, you really want to evaluate that, because a lot of people got wiped out in 2008. When things crashed. And I believe the crash we're heading into is going to be ultimately worse than that. And a lot of people are going to get wiped out. Retirement savings, people have been saving up all their lives for their years ahead. A lot of people are going to get wiped out. So people really need to evaluate where they're at financially. In terms of just something really basic, I believe in having a 6-month emergency fund where look at what happened in 2008. People lost their jobs or their businesses went under all of a sudden because 62% of all Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. They couldn't pay the mortgage. Foreclosures skyrocketed. People went from living a middle-class lifestyle to being out on the street very, very rapidly. So you need to have a cushion, something to fall back on, at least in the short term. Now looking longer term, I think things like gold and silver, precious metals, are a way to protect your wealth. My wife and I believe in that. And then even longer term, we believe that, as the economic crisis fully unfolds, having supplies of food and things you'll need in the event of an emergency of a long-term emergency, I think are wise to do. Also, whether we see any type of bank holidays, banks shutting down for a period of time, not being able to access ATMs for a period of time, well, like we saw in Cyprus and Greece, having some cash at home for the things you need to buy for your family to keep things going. So all these different things I think are wise moves, and then whatever you can do to become more self-sufficient from the system, because the system is going to completely fail, I believe.
Michael, we're in the midst of the presidential primaries, and there's each of the candidates have got their own platforms. Not to comment on those platforms, but are there any policies that any politician from either party could be adopting now that would make this crisis not as bad as what we're going to see, or things that would really help Americans and the world get ready for this?
Well, personally, I believe we're so close to it now that there's not really anything that can be done to avert the crisis that's coming. Now, for years, I've been wishing that politicians would say, let's shut down the Federal Reserve. Let's shut down the central planners. How about we let the free market decide what our interest rates are going to be? What a novel concept. Why would that be such a bad thing? Why not let the free market, plan our economy rather than, so I would love to see the Federal Reserve shut down, the federal government take over the issuing of our money. But that's not going to happen. All these candidates, they're just suggesting slight tweaks to the way we're currently doing things. They say, well, let's raise taxes slightly, let's lower taxes slightly, and so there's no fundamental transformations. And then, of course, we see the leaders from both parties just wanting to go into more debt, this recent debt agreement, where, since Barack Obama set foot in the White House, we've been stealing more than $100 million from future generations of Americans every single hour of every single day ever since he set foot in the White House. And yet the Republicans have been enabling this. The Republicans in the House have gone along the whole way. And so, I believe what we're doing to future generations of Americans is beyond criminal. And, we've piled up, all this debt, the biggest pile of government debt the world has ever seen, and then, the total ball of wax, all government debt, corporate debt, individual debt, all forms of debt. It's over $62 trillion now out there. Well, 40 years ago, it was about $3 trillion. So we've been on the greatest debt binge in history, so as we've been living way above our means. It's a debt-fueled prosperity. We've been making really tragically bad decisions for decades, and yet we just continue to do the exact same things, go down the exact same course. And the current crop of politicians, they just are suggesting minor course corrections, which isn't going to get the job done. So I don't believe there's any solution on the national level that's coming. The crisis that's right in front of us is imminent, I believe. There's not going to be any avoiding it, and it's going to be a disaster of historic proportions.
Michael, we're in the midst of the presidential primaries, and there's each of the candidates have got their own platforms. Not to comment on those platforms, but are there any policies that any politician from either party could be adopting now that would make this crisis not as bad as what we're going to see, or things that would really help Americans and the world get ready for this?
Well, personally, I believe we're so close to it now that there's not really anything that can be done to avert the crisis that's coming. Now, for years, I've been wishing that politicians would say, let's shut down the Federal Reserve. Let's shut down the central planners. How about we let the free market decide what our interest rates are going to be? What a novel concept. Why would that be such a bad thing? Why not let the free market, plan our economy rather than, so I would love to see the Federal Reserve shut down, the federal government take over the the issuing of our money. But that's not going to happen. All these candidates, they're just suggesting slight tweaks to the way we're currently doing things. They say, well, let's raise taxes slightly, let's lower taxes slightly, and so there's no fundamental transformations. And then, of course, we see the leaders from both parties just wanting to go into more debt, this recent debt agreement, where, since Barack Obama set foot in the White House, we've been stealing more than $100 million from future generations of Americans every single hour of every single day ever since he set foot in the White House. And yet the Republicans have been enabling this. The Republicans in the House have gone along the whole way. And so, I believe what we're doing to future generations of Americans is beyond criminal. And, we've piled up, all this debt, the biggest pile of government debt the world has ever seen, and then, the total ball of wax, all government debt, corporate debt, individual debt, all forms of debt. It's over $62 trillion now out there. Well, 40 years ago, it was about $3 trillion. So we've been on the greatest debt binge in history, so as we've been living way above our means. It's a debt-fueled prosperity. We've been making really tragically bad decisions for decades, and yet we just continue to do the exact same things, go down the exact same course. And the current crop of politicians, they just are suggesting minor course corrections, which isn't going to get the job done. So I don't believe there's any solution on the national level that's coming. The crisis that's right in front of us is imminent, I believe. There's not going to be any avoiding it, and it's going to be a disaster of historic proportions.
Michael, we're up against our hard line. It's time to have to end, unfortunately. So many more things to talk about. Any final messages you'd like to leave with our listeners?
Yeah, I don't want people to be in fear, to live in fear. My wife and I, we don't live in fear. We actually believe the greatest chapters of our lives are ahead. I believe life in America is about to fundamentally change. I believe we're headed for the greatest economic crisis we've ever seen. But it's when times are darkest that the greatest heroes are needed. I believe there will be great opportunities to do great things in the times we're moving into. And so I would encourage people not to dig a hole and try to hide from the world, but now's the time to step up, let your voice be heard, do great things, and look forward to the challenges that are ahead, because I think it's going to be a challenging time to be alive, but also a thrilling time to be alive. And so I believe there's hope in understanding what's happening. I believe there's hope in getting prepared. And it's the people who right now are mocking the coming crisis, who aren't getting prepared at all, who they put all their hope in the stock market and in the things they've accumulated. Those are the people that are going to be jumping off of buildings, that are giving into depression and despair. But I don't plan to be depressed at all. I look forward to the times that are coming and to what my wife and I are going to be doing.
Sure, Michael, I actually share very much your optimism. I think the next 8 to 12 years will be horrific. But on the other side of that, I think the world will take giant steps forward, because hopefully we will learn what caused this problem, mistakes we've made, corrections, because all of this is about change trying to happen. And that's what we're going to go through, and it's going to be significant change. But those who prepare, those who honestly look at this, there'll be great opportunities. So, Michael, how could people learn more about, follow your site, the name of your blogs?
Yeah, my website is the Economic Collapse blog. You can find it at theeconomiccollapseblog.com, or just go to Google and type in the Economic Collapse. It'll come right up. I got another website, endoftheamericandream.com, and then I've got 2 books, The Beginning of the End and Get Prepared Now. You can find those on Amazon.com.
Michael, thanks an awful lot. Enjoyed the conversation. We'll have to have you back again. Talk to you again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on.
Bye-bye.